A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to be talking around some issues about being above reproach. Now, if you talk to pastors and church leaders anywhere, they will often be able to reflect on the laws and the regulations that are the obligations of every church entity. And with churches growing and with new churches being planted, it is a great time to reflect on what sort of compliance issues that churches typically work with. Our special guest today is a lawyer. He's across the issues of governance and leadership, including the challenges that not only leaders but also many volunteers are facing as they serve a kingdom purpose in their local church. James Tan is a director at Vocare Law. He's an expert in litigation and not-for-profit governance, including charities and schools, and we're going to be talking and getting into some issues that you might be able to help us get into. You can help direct where our conversation goes when we open our talkback lines. James, a special welcome along to 2020.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here.
James, you work with lots of churches and Christian charities, organisations that have a dimension to them. You might even call it a kingdom dimension to them. I imagine that's not just like churches that are specifically church-oriented, but also there'd be a lot of companies that actually want to keep Christ at the centre of their entity, and they're up against the same sorts of issues again too, aren't they? It's quite widespread.
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting you should say that when you talk about companies. Vocare Law itself is a Christian organization who were founded by two great Christian men, Graham Corney, who had a lot to do with the ACC Church, and Andrew Lin, who also had a lot to do with the Baptist churches. And they established Corney and Lin as a partnership which grew, but very much grew with the mission and vision to be a Christian law firm. And so we've had a long history of serving Christian organizations, faith-based organizations, churches, schools, and aged care as well. It's challenging to be a Christian organization in the legal world.
You're a Christian organization, but that doesn't mean that the laws of the land don't apply to you. We might even get into reflecting on what happened in our earlier conversation. I know you heard a little bit about what we were talking about, religious freedom. But when you are a Christian and you're passionate about serving God and you've got an idea of, the mission that He has and His calling on your life, you've still got to get across the rules and regulations that governments have in place for organizations.
Yes, absolutely. And what we've seen in recent history are many institutions that have fallen short of that. And it's not just Christian organizations, but it would also be the banking sector, the aged care sector. A big emphasis has been placed on good governance, directors, boards of directors exercising oversight and accountability in relation to the activities of the organization, their CEO, and making sure that people are doing right, protecting the vulnerable, protecting the weak, protecting the innocent, just like the Bible tells us to do.
And, interesting when you say that there are secular organizations, and some of them, of course, doing a wonderful job, ticking all the boxes, good governance practices. And then you've got Christian organizations ticking all the boxes, good governance practices, but actually, is there a higher calling for that Christian organization? Because what we want to see for Christian leaders and organizations is that they're above reproach. That's not easy, is it?
Absolutely. It's very difficult. I love the way a director of mission described it, and that's director of mission at a Christian faith-based aged care provider. He called it in doing a risk analysis and identifying what risks are exposed, what risk the organization is exposed to. He described it as falling into a compliance-driven agenda as opposed to a mission-driven agenda. And I think we can, as Christian organizations, get so wrapped up in ticking the boxes that we forget that what we're supposed to do is something even more. God's mission is the mission, not the compliance mission.
You know what? I think you've touched on something that if you're looking for some gold in a conversation like this one today, and I suspect we can probably expound a little bit upon this, because it's interesting when you say that God's mission is what we're called to, and if you lose sight of that, sometimes you can just lower your vision a little bit and just focus on compliance. And I think every Christian organisation needs to have people who actually keep their vision up on God's mission rather than the compliance, but you can't actually turn a blind eye to the compliance.
Absolutely. I think undertaking a Christian mission is risky. There's this wonderful book by a gentleman by the name of Steve Judd called Keeping Faith, and in it he talks about a risk theology. And he goes into how Christian organizations have to take on risk to accomplish their mission. It's not about risk elimination, but understanding the appetite of risk you have to be able to pursue God's mission. I think if we think about mission organizations, organizations that send missionaries to the deepest and darkest parts of the world, that's risky business, but someone has to do it. And how do we do it in a way that protects the vulnerable? How do we do it in a way that protects the children? How do we do it in a way that protects the volunteers? That's a big question for organizations to grapple with.
And, I'm reminded of the scripture, and I'm pretty sure this was Jesus who said you got to count the cost. And counting the cost isn't, and that might even sound like it's conflict with the idea of stepping out in faith, because sometimes we're talking about stepping out in faith, finances and the sorts of regulations you might need to meet. But counting the cost would be, as you say, some sort of a risk assessment. What's the risk if I do step out in faith? What have I got to do to be able to not embarrass God? Because that's the risk, isn't it? You might embarrass God because you step out, you didn't count the cost, and you fail.
That's right. I think it's not only Jesus who would have said it, but it's in Ecclesiastes too. Yes. Taking all about considering the risk before you undertake a project. I agree. I think what I really believe is that as leaders, as overseers of a church, as directors of an organization, Christian organization, you have a higher call. It's not just to be compliant, but it's to be above reproach. Above reproach means ensuring that your organization has a good reputation before man, before God, doing the right thing, accomplishing the mission, living out the mission, and that sometimes has risk. Sometimes you have to take on the risk. Sometimes you have to accept that if you do something, there's a chance it might go wrong, but you have to do it anyway.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction, you're a lawyer.
Yes.
So when stuff does go wrong, people will often pick up the phone. They'll be calling James Tan and saying, "Hey, James, I'm in a pickle. How do I get out of this?" So you started helping organizations get through some tough issues when there's a dispute or when there's some sort of breakdown, there's some sort of relationship issue. That's where you come to the fore. You are actually promoting the idea of good governance, but sometimes you need some help to get out, don't you?
Absolutely, and I think there's the proactive element and there's the reactive element. The proactive element is how are you going with your monitoring the effectiveness of your policies, making sure you've got the right training in place, the right procedures, the right blue card checks, the right registers. And then there's the reactive bit. What is your training in the event something does happen, in case there is an incident, in case someone gets hurt, in case someone is falls victim to something inappropriate? How do you respond, and how do you do so in a way that is above reproach? These are great questions.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Who you're going to call, and I don't know whether this sounds like a great plug for you, but who you're going to call when you've got a problem. A lawyer who's got his focus on the big picture of mission, or on someone who just wants to tick the boxes of compliance. Let's come into this sort of compliance, though. What sort of compliance areas are the most significant that we might fall down on in a Christian organization?
There's plenty. I think there's the obvious ones. Privacy, there's finances, but I think the one that, to me, would be of most significance in the coming years would be around running investigations from a reportable child-safe prospective reportable conduct scheme, as they're calling it, and starting to roll it out in Queensland. They already have it in Victoria and New South Wales and ACT. I think that's really important because that requires Christian organizations, schools even, and aged care and even camping sites to have good policies in place to proactively prevent child abuse, but also reactively, when a reportable conduct scheme comes into full effect, how are you going to investigate issues or allegations of child safety? How are you going to respond to it and react to it? And these are things which are go towards helping an organization be beyond reproach, because what we have seen in the past is people being incredibly hurt by when institutions have not responded to allegations of child abuse well. And we also see in the media, ready, willing, and able to have a field day with Christian organizations when they perceive that they have not responded well.
It's all still fresh in everyone's mind in some sense. Those sorts of inquiries into institutional abuse, churches in the headlines every day. And do you put that down to the fact that there might be some poor governance that had been in place? Now, these things come to light, and then you fix things, and then you say, well, I have an aspiration now to be beyond reproach. And my suspicion is that's where church denominations and church organisations are at. They've got policies and things in place now, but again, those things have to be continually monitored and updated, and they have to be looked after, and they have to be implemented, and that sort of sometimes is like around an annual training program for people who are involved. And this becomes like, this is compliance, and it's actually hard work to do that before you've actually done any ministry.
Absolutely. And I think it's difficult. It is really difficult. And if you're a growing church, if you're a church that has lots of kids that wants to run a big kids program, a camp program, and I've got young children myself, and they can't stop themselves from getting injured. But imagine having a big camp where you're taking all of these kids out to do all sorts of fun activities where they learn about Jesus, but also are exposed to risk. How are you going to do your risk assessments? How are you going to make sure that your volunteers are checked with blue cards? And how are you going to ensure that that all the policies and training in place is one thing, and how are you going to respond to any complaints that come in? Is another thing. I think governors, a lot of people who come onto the boards of churches are well-meaning people, but they may not necessarily have the skills, for example, in investigations or how to implement a complaints policy. Those would be challenging things that will challenge these leaders, I think.
Life, culture, and current events from a biblical perspective. This is 2020 with Neil Johnson on Vision Christian Radio.
Well, what a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation about Christians and churches being above reproach. And you probably don't have to think too deeply to know that sometimes you get into some grey areas and there's some space where it looks like there could be some improvement. Hey, when we talk about these, how the rubber hits the road here, James, somebody in your church, let's just say it's a parent of a child who comes to a youth group activity, and they make a complaint to the church about an incident that happens. Is this a good way to start with a way we can describe the way you're talking about these things?
I think that's a great way, Neil. Thank you.
Okay. So when someone makes a complaint, what's the church response?
Yes. I think the first thing that a church needs to do is take it seriously. If we talk about being above reproach, there has been a criticism that has been leveled against the church for a long time. That is, churches not taking complaints seriously, brushing things under the carpet, ignoring it. Sometimes complaints come in, they can be confronting. Sometimes you go, well, is that a legitimate complaint? Is it frivolous? Is it vexatious? These are questions that I've got so much to do in my day job. I've got so much to do with running a ministry. I don't have time for this. But I think what I will say is you have to treat every complaint as something important, something that's concerning the flock, and you have to listen to it. You have to give it the time of day. Then the next thing to do is think about the safety and vulnerability of the subject person. If these are children, you have to be sensitive to the confidentiality. You have to be sensitive to them being young people. Sometimes, if they're young girls, there could be added sensitivity about that. If you're, a pastor with a large booming voice and a big presence, they may find it quite intimidating to be able to bring some of these complaints to the light. So, be conscious of those sorts of issues around power imbalances and that as well.
So you take the complaints seriously. Who makes the assessment, whether it's a frivolous complaint, a vexatious complaint, or whether this is one that really needs to be followed up? Somebody has to make the call, don't they?
Absolutely. And I think this is where there's two things here. First is, what does your process say? What does your policy say? But I think that's an important part of this. And again, this comes back to accountability, being above reproach. You don't want all of these decisions to be made just by the pastor, by the senior pastor. This is why it's wonderful to have an overseer layer, a board of elders, governors who are going, well, if this is a complaint about the conduct of a pastor, we don't want a pastor to be involved in this. We want to be able to look at this objectively, independently, and care for the community, and also potentially lean on the experts in the denomination, perhaps. Many denominations, if you're part of the ACC or Queensland Baptist or Churches of Christ, would have experts within that denomination body who are able to provide you with the assistance to investigate further.
And these days, child protection policies, and I would dare to say for all the major denominations, and that's probably most likely for most people listening to us, there are thick books that are written on this that churches have, and that's the compliance guidelines. Now, for someone to be able to make sense of those, because, and I'll get your impression here, because, you can read through some of these sorts of things around child protection, and you've got to be a lawyer to understand it. So is this where it's important to have someone mature and perhaps even with some sort of legal background or some understanding of some of that legal jargon to be able to interpret what those booklets are saying?
Well, I think the first thing to say is you got to have a policy that works for you. And it can't just be a policy that sits on a shelf, but it has to be a policy that's converted into a procedure and trained upon. It really helps to have, in my church, we have someone like a director of operations whose job is purely to look into all of the compliance-related issues within the church, but not just have it say compliance, but somehow turn it from compliance into mission. How do these policies serve what we're trying to do? How do these policies uplift the quality of our mission? And so being able to run that training, be able to keep those registers, being able to make sure that the volunteers understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, these are important things to do. Again, if you don't have that that sort of resource available in your church, lean on your denomination, because lots of denominations are pushing out resources which hopefully make more sense than if they were pushed out by a lawyer like me.
Let's ask the question around, if a complaint is made, is a verbal complaint just as strong as a written complaint? If someone complains to the youth leader, who may not be across all sorts of, compliance regulations, but if say the parent of that child we were talking about, who might be part of the youth group, if they make a verbal complaint to the youth leader, is that the same as making the written complaint to the church office that might be followed through by people who are, in charge?
Well, most policies that I see give equal weight to verbal complaints and written complaints. Obviously, a written complaint is more serious and goes through a far more formal process, but verbal complaints are also encouraged to be given the same weight, because sometimes some of these complaints, which may be quite serious, start off as a verbal complaint because many of these communities are full of well-meaning people that don't want to rock the boat, but may have heard something, the child may have said something that gives them concern, and they've got to raise it. They've got to speak to someone about it, but they don't want to crash the church doing it. And then if it gets ignored, if it gets swept on the carpet, then somehow it starts to escalate to a more serious written complaint. Sometimes you bring in the media. So my encouragement is, look, even if it's a verbal complaint, treat it seriously. If you're a youth pastor that sort of receives it and goes, I don't know what to do with it, speak to someone. Don't just, we're all part of a team. Don't just take all of this on yourself, because you don't want to find yourself in a position where you could be criticized.
Yeah. And I guess if the verbal complaint that might be made on Friday night at youth group isn't acted on, then that parent who might have a bee in their bonnet right now around their child's treatment or however that looks, they're going to escalate things dramatically. Because how do you reflect, James, on the fact that, if a parent has got a complaint, they're going to be a whole lot angrier if nobody actually takes them seriously.
Absolutely. And I think it's not just in a youth group context or a church context. It's even in a professional context. When you have a complaint that you sit on for too long, people get frustrated. People feel like you're not listening. And sometimes, in the worst case scenario, you've got a serious complaint that's just not being dealt with in a timely manner. So my encouragement to anyone who's thinking about their complaints policies and procedures is make sure you set some targets for yourself to close it out quickly, whether it's in the form of a register that keeps all the logs, but jump onto it and try to jump on into a way that is restorative, in a way where you can have conversations with people and find solutions. Don't just flip straight into the formal written process where everyone gets a chance to put in their written complaint and have a stoush about it. Try and see if you can find solutions which are optimal, where people can find healing.
And we might even, in our minds, we might be thinking of some level of, it's a sexual abuse type complaint that people might be complaining about, but it could be a complaint across all sorts of things, bullying or, he said, she said, all sorts of things like that. The scope of the things that people would complain about, some of these are much more serious than others.
Absolutely. And I know in the conversation you had just before my conversation, you were talking about religious discrimination. And I think the world is starting to become more aware of things that pastors says, a pastor could say around, which are potentially discriminatory or potentially insensitive. We're becoming more aware of gender issues. We're becoming more aware of neurodiversity. And I know, some pastors like to inject a little bit of humor and sometimes could say something insensitive or maybe perceived to be insensitive or maybe someone might find hurtful. And I think just having these conversations to go, we're all learning, we're all trying to, I'm sorry about that. I'll try again I'll try a bit better next time. And potentially these conversations can go quite far and potentially be an opportunity for grace and Christ to shine a light in.
Just quickly, James, are these sorts of complaints that people make, are they on the rise? They're happening more often? Whereas you used to think that a complaint might come through every now and then, now they're happening more frequently?
I'm perceiving it to happen very frequently. Certainly when I started my career, I would get... I remember when I started my career, we would get few complaints. And some complaints would be something like, what do we do about the potential exorcism? I want to complain about that.
Okay, all right, okay.
But these days, I'm seeing complaints about, the pastor said something that really hurt me, and I'm trying to speak up because I'm wanting to see change in this space. And so I think people are becoming more aware. People are feeling like they have a moral obligation to speak up. And I think it's and organizations trying to encourage it as well, because we're trying to make amends for the past when we have swept things under the carpet.
Hey, James, just before we start to get onto some more other practical rubber hits the road things, come back to the scriptures for a moment, because as I understand it, one of your favourite characters who exemplifies what we're talking about today is Daniel.
Yes.
So tell us about Daniel.
Daniel, I think, exemplifies compliance as we would like it to be, Neil, because I think he had an answer for everything, and it didn't quite matter whichever government was in rule at the time, because he went through a few different kings in his time,
yes.
A few different regulations and a few different laws, and he always had a very well-worded answer that earned him the favor of the kings at the relevant time. But he also knew when he needed to take a stand for mission, for his what he believed to be his gospel calling and his mission calling, I should say. And I think similar to us, there will be times when we need to be ready to step into the lion's den, but do so in a way that glorifies God. I love it after he comes out from the lion's den, the king just goes, well, that was amazing. And we need to really celebrate Daniel now. We really need to acknowledge his God and how his God has provided for him and protected him. And I'm hopeful that we can do the same.
So getting to a point where you are above reproach, and people couldn't fault Daniel. And so that's where the whole plan came along. Let's set him up. He's going to be praying at the window. When we see him praying, we'll go back to the king and we'll say, here's your guy who you thought was above reproach, but he's breaking the law. And so then, he's thrown into the lion's den. But coming out of the lion's den, as you say, he's given special privileges and leadership. His reputation is restored, and now he has more power than ever. So actually doing the above reproach thing in our local church, do you think that leads to the higher expectation, but also the higher respect that will come from that?
Yes, I think so. And I think because if you stand for nothing, you fall for everything, right?
Yeah.
And I think having a solid foundation which you can stand on, which you can point back to when things do go wrong, because things will inevitably go wrong. And being able to say, well, we had these policies in place, we followed these policies, we did our very best, and we did everything we can to protect the vulnerable and the weak and those that are that have concerns. We did everything we could protect them. This still happened, but we stand by them, we'll protect them, we will provide a pastoral support for them. And I think if I were to use an example of a missions organization that sends missionaries overseas, sometimes to the toughest parts of the world, sometimes they go to difficult places, and sometimes they lose their life. It's part of the job, if you could say, I guess you could say. These mission organizations have an obligation to take care of the missionaries, their volunteers, to give to show them duty of care, to do whatever they can to preserve safety. But sometimes bad things still happen. And I think being able to say that we did the best thing we could, we had all these policies in place, and we're offering pastoral support to the people that need it. And God is still going to be glorified through this, and trying to find a way for God to be glorified through it. That's important.
Bad things can still happen, even if you have the best laid plans. Right. Let's talk about best laid plans here for a few moments, because you might be thinking that individuals have plans, but if you're a part of a local church or a Christian mission organisation, you want the plans to be a little bit deeper than that, don't you? You want them to have some deep roots, even in what you'd call the culture of an organisation. And you've got to be able to work hard to build a culture, haven't you?
Absolutely. I think culture is something that's so important for church leaders to set. I think that's an important part of being an overseer, and I think you don't want to be a lazy board of directors that just leaves everything to your senior pastor, but you want to be invested in the governance and the strategy, and being giving accountability and oversight to your senior pastor. These are important things, and I think making sure that you've got, it can be a bit of a dirty word in church context these days, but making sure you have a diverse board that's reflective of the community that you're trying to reach out to and serve. Making sure you've got young people on your board, because you want to be able to equip and empower the next generation. If you're a church that's down in the south side of Queensland, which are all of a sudden you're finding all of these people of my ethnicity coming through your doors, you want to make sure that you've got people who understand that culture as well, so you can reach out to them. These are important things to think about.
Sometimes the leader appoints their friends to be, on their board or their eldership, whatever you call it. There's a tempting thing to just rubber stamp everything that comes by. And as you say, you can't be lazy when you're in a position of leadership if you're responsible on those sorts of positions. Sometimes people in church life, they talk about yes men on the board. Someone who'll always say yes and never argue with where the leadership wants to go, ordinarily the pastor. So somehow or other, you've got to be the sort of person who has a voice, not afraid to speak up.
Absolutely. And I think it's not about being afraid to speak up, but I think it's about being able to ask the right questions. You don't have to be a command and control board. You don't want to be. You want to be able to empower your senior pastor to do what he's the best at. But you want to be able to keep him accountable and be above reproach. And you want to be able to set the right culture right from the top. I think a strategic plan works great. A strategic plan which is long-term and that gives mind to the succession of your board, your senior pastor. These are all good things. And also gives mind to the skills matrix that you need for your senior pastor to have a board which he can rely upon and get his back. So if you have a pastor that's not so good at the whole HR, work health and safety thing, getting someone in on your board of directors or your eldership board who is good at work health and safety and HR, these are helpful things to think about.
Now, here's an interesting little diversion maybe, but I think add to our conversation. Some people listening to us today will be part of a church that is part of a denomination. And there's some protections in a denomination because there's something in common with all of these sorts of, boxes to tick. Compliance issues are usually looked after by someone who really has got their head around these things. They're producing official documents. But if you're in a church that has a little bit more autonomy, they're separate from a denomination, that makes them a little bit more vulnerable, no doubt, or at least you've got to work a whole lot harder.
I think so, and I think this is probably one of the most beautiful things that I'm seeing these days as churches are being stretched more and more. Denominations coming together and relying upon each other, forming collectives where they can share information. And I think we are a body of Christ. I think we have, we've got to help our smaller churches. We've got to, if our bigger churches have resources, they've got an obligation to share it and share their knowledge and share their wisdom. And I think my encouragement would be to everyone in the body of Christ, regardless of whether you're in a small church or big church, regardless of whatever position you're in, lean on one another.
Okay, so if you're in a church situation, and let's say a small church, because you might have larger churches that actually have some of these bases covered. Let's talk about the small church or the church plant, because someone's got a gift, they've got a calling, they're going to plant a church, and they're faced with the fact that there's an awful lot of bases now need to be covered because there's compliance issues. Yep. Sharing the load here, what should it look like if you've got someone who is just an amazing pastor, preacher, winning souls, discipleship oriented, we're sort of talking about Mr. or Mrs. Perfect, but all this other stuff around the fringes of what has to happen. You've got to surround yourself with some people who've got different skills and gifts to what you have.
That's right. I think what I loved was what a HR recruitment professional said to me now is you'll always have gaps. But you want to make sure you've got the right people around the table so whatever falls through doesn't fall through all the gaps at the same time. So I think making sure you've got a team around you who can cover that gaps. And I think having a board of overseers who understand, who reflect the community, as we mentioned a little bit before, but also are also able to complement the senior pastor's gaps works really well. So think about, what's your skills matrix? What is the hard skills that you need around the board table so that you can have a safe place of worship that can thrive and grow. But also think about the personality traits as well. And I think even something like gender, if you have, if you want to be able to reach the women in your community as well, or having people who are sensitive to those sorts of things really helps.
What you're touching on, what some people react to, the thought of levels of diversity, and sometimes we react to that along the lines of the sort of things that are being pushed for by the LGBTQ people with their agenda. But it's real advantage, isn't it, for a Christian church to have, as you said, different ethnicities represented, and also different genders represented at leadership level. That in itself is a real bonus. There's real strength to it.
I think so. And I think you don't want to have diversity for diversity's sake, just like you don't want to have compliance for compliance sake. How does that diversity support the mission of your church? How does it help your kingdom purpose thrive and grow?
Some churches pick their own pastors. And, there's often processes that are going through, when one pastor is resigning or retiring, elderships often, when it's a congregationally driven church, they're on the lookout for the sort of person who will best suit their needs. These sorts of questions around compliance and understanding all of the regulations, those have got to be balanced, haven't they, against this idea of the person you want to choose that might be mission-oriented and not so much compliance-oriented. How do you advise churches when they're making those sorts of decisions about who to choose as the leader when you've got a transition happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think identifying your needs is really helpful. And I think having a plan is really helpful as well. I think picking a leader that's balanced, that balances both the pragmatism and the optimism really helps. I have a personal view that if you have faith with your eyes closed, that's just recklessness. You want to be able to have faith that is with eyes open, that sees the difficulties in front of you, but is able to still rely on God to take the next step. And I think all of that is to say, you want to bring on the pastor that has the skills in compliance, in leadership, but also has the faith and the vision and the mission. It sounds like looking for a bit of a mythological person, but I think if you don't aspire to above reproach, you may settle for something less.
And if you don't have a complaints process in place, I imagine it's the case that what you were doing in mission, being proactive in your community, all of a sudden is hijacked because it will take all your time if you don't have some sort of a process. The process actually is something that should make your life easier, shouldn't it? Because you know that if you're ticking those boxes on the process, you've done all you can do up to this point without being completely 100% absorbed in that.
Absolutely. And I think your processes, your compliance and your governance have to support your mission. It has to advance your mission. If it's just a document that's on the shelf that looks great, well, it's of limited use. You really want to have something that can be transformed into advancing your kingdom purpose practically. And I think this is where, this is sometimes where governance and operations can be at odds, because governance just wants to have a great policy sometimes, but they need more than that. They need to have a policy that can be implemented by the pastor and his administrative team.
What about when you recognise, as you might be listening to a conversation with you here, James, that there are some weaknesses in my local church or in the organisation that I'm serving? It might be a parachurch organisation. It's not necessarily church, but it's it's under the auspices of a church body. And you know that you need to have some upskilling. Is there a sort of a minimum standard that you recommend that people do? Are there any particular, formal programmings that you can study, or, is there something you ought to be looking for?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the benefits of the world, of the secular world, and as we know it, being so interested in governance, is there's heaps of governance courses out there offered by people like the Australian Institute of Company Directors, the Governance Institute, etc. I'm a big fan of Christian Ministry Advancement, CMA, who just recently had a conference over the last week, and they try to approach it from a Christian lens. How does governance work with Jesus in the center at the top?
Wow, great!
And so I think that's a powerful tool. They have all sorts of benchmarks that you can try and hit and that help you as part of your accreditation process. Make sure you've ticked as many boxes as you can, and they try to approach compliance as best as possible with a Christian lens through it.
Let's come back to some of those really important things I think that you'd want to leave listeners with today. You mentioned reportable conduct.
Yes.
So if you're a leader in a Christian organisation,
yes,
you have to know what is reportable. Is there in a nutshell thing that you can describe? Is there a rule of thumb, how you actually think about what's reportable? Is there a list of things that are reportable? I mean, is it just, because someone complained?
Well, there's lots of great resources on the QFCC website, which is the Queensland Families Children Commission website. And it's helpful because they're the ones spearheading the reportable conduct scheme at the moment, and they've come up with a lot of resources of what standards you have to try and achieve through your policy making. They've got 10 child-safe standards that come out of effectively the Royal Commission into Institutional Abuse. So there's lots of resources there. And that's really a design about protecting the vulnerable, people from an Aboriginal background perhaps, and young children who may be exposed to instances of abuse. So there are lots of resources there, and I think that I would say is mission critical, because as a church we want to be protecting the vulnerable.
Yes, a high focus on vulnerability, because as you say, if you're a Christian church, you can be all gung-ho about being missional, but the people that we're reaching out to oftentimes are going to find themselves in vulnerable circumstances, and we need to be able to pay special attention to them.
That's right.
The main points I note here, pardon me, clarity, timeliness, and training. And, if you're talking, at the end of our conversation here, the sort of things that you want for listeners to take away from a conversation like this, clarity. How do you describe that?
I would say clarity is being able to understand the policy and the procedure, and not just yourself as the person's implementing the policy, but for your community to be able to understand who can I talk to if I have an issue.
So either a denomination comes up with some sort of policy or document, the leadership says we need to implement this, and then there's somebody who's going to train people who are hands-on, whether it's the children's ministry, the youth ministry, could be any sort of
the volunteers. My church has my son who's really young goes to these kids ministries, and he instantly knows who he feels safe with because they've got that church, the Sunday school church shirt on. But even your welcome team as well, they all usually have the same uniform, and being able to know that this person with a lanyard. So I think for these volunteers who have such an important part facing everyone in the community, to be able to know how to implement the policy. If someone says, someone did something to me and I'm really worried about it, what do you do? How do you run it through the process? And then timeliness as well. So as you mentioned, one of the things that helps organizations be above reproach is responding to a complaint, not just sweeping it away, but being able to keep people in the loop. Because I find if you let some of these complaints drag on, and I've seen complaints go through the formal process where they're formal complaints, and you've got to notify the pastor, you've got to notify the complainant, you've got to notify the community, you've got to notify the board, and it's a massive investigation. And the longer it drags on, the more hurt it causes. So being able to keep it quick, being able as quick as it possibly can, being able to run it well, it just minimizes the hurt involved.
And so, interesting as you say, that person with the T-shirt on or they've got a lanyard on, it shouldn't just be anyone who's ready to step up. Although that might be an appropriate person, but because you've got a training regime, you're going to be bringing that person up to speed. Yep. But you do want to be able to trust those people who are being representative of your church because they're wearing the official lanyard or they're wearing the official shirt. Those sorts of things become very important. You can't just ignore that. That's
right. And I think being able to make sure that you've got the right people there too. Our church has been expanding the number of blue card checks we do, which sounds like a pain, but it's something we see as quite necessary because we're finding more and more vulnerable people are walking through our doors, and we want the community that are coming in and the community that we already have to feel safe with the people that are effectively the visible representatives.
Well, great insights, James. And for listeners who want to connect with you, let me give the website for vocarelaw.com.au. Vocare Law, VOCARELAW, vocarelaw.com.au. And for some who've got a little bit of history in southeast Queensland, formerly known as Corney and Lind Lawyers. Lots of listeners might even recognise the names Graham Corney and Andrew Lind, who have been Christians at the heart of their law firm for generations. It's quite amazing. Vocarelaw.com.au. James Tan is a director at Vocare Law, an expert in litigation and not-for-profit governance, including charities and schools. But James, just great getting your insights today. Thanks so much for really good insights around governance and what's essential for every church and Christian organisation to observe. Really appreciate you taking time to share things with listeners today on 2020.
My pleasure, Neil. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.